Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming this evening. My name's Emma Moore. I'm the Assistant Curator for the Public Programme here at Nottingham Contemporary. And I'd like to welcome you to this evening's installation and also talk titled Film After the End of Art, which has been curated by Duncan White. It's been a real pleasure to present these works in an installation context, and I hope that most of you have had a chance to spend some time in the space and really see all of the works that are on display. The installation was prompted by the inclusion of work by Gustav Metzger in the exhibition upstairs, and thinking more broadly about Metzger's practice from his manifesto on autodestructive art to his formative role in staging the destruction in Art Symposium of 1966. At this time, as one of the reviews that are on the table over there mentions, if society can accept war, hydrogen bombs, violence and murder, these factors should be incorporated into the art of our time. Destructive art would reflect a destructive society. And from this end of art emerged film, a medium which allowed artists to experiment with time, movement and appropriated material and subvert the mass media. And it was becoming an increasingly popular with experimental artists in the UK and in the US, as you can see in the works that are on display here. Presented are works of 5 artists who explore destruction and violence in quite different ways through film. And it's a real pleasure to have Duncan White here, who will speak a little more on each of the works and drawing connections between them and why he's kind of put these pieces together. Duncan is a postdoctoral research fellow at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design in London. He's the lead author and co-editor of Expanded Cinema, Art, Performance and Film, published in 2011. He is currently working on a book entitled Art After Destruction of Experience, an event-based research projects that include light writing, which explores the use of text in artist film and video. So I'll hand over to Duncan, who will do a presentation, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. And there is, of course, plenty of time for questions from the audience, so I hope you'll be able to join the conversation. So I'll hand over to Duncan, and thank you very much for coming.
A really nice introduction. I should say thanks to Emma for everything she's done today. It was really nice to be invited to participate in the public programme for Somewhat Abstract. And I had the lovely job of being able to just give Emma a kind of wish list of films that I would like to show, and then Emma did all the hard work of putting the show together. And thanks to James, who's up there in the box, for his help to putting the show together, which I think looks really good. So what I'm going to do this evening is to take Gustav Metzger and various aspects of his work as a kind of starting point for what I'm going to discuss, and as a way of kind of trying to link the different works that we've got on display today. There are various starting points that I could have used. John Latham would have been also an interesting starting point. But Metzger's work is so kind of interesting for me and kind of challenging in lots of ways that I really wanted to kind of take the opportunity to use Metzger's work as a kind of starting point, as a way of addressing what happens in terms of film and artists who use different forms of media from about 1966 onwards. I've called today Film After the End of Art, which probably needs some qualifying. Art has obviously ended a number of times, but still manages somehow to continue. To paraphrase the art historian Hans Belting, we have heard before of the destruction of art, yet every time that apparently inevitable and violent end was lamented, things nevertheless carried on. So for Turner, photography signalled the end of art. Art ended again with Dada. Then again in the 1960s, Fluxus seemed to finalise things. For T.J. Clarke, art ended slightly earlier with the interminable final long shot of Visconti's Rocco and his Brothers. For Arthur Danto, art, as we understand the term, ended when Sherry Levine re-photographed Walker Evans's photograph of the Gudge family in Depression-era New Mexico and called it original art. And for some, more recently, art ended with when the digital image destroyed the supposedly indexical veracity of its analogue relation. Now, since we seem to be in the business this evening of qualification, and I'm not just referring to the football, and obviously that was a lot funnier when I wrote it before the events last Thursday, I should qualify all of this by saying that by art, Belting meant art history, while Turner obviously meant painting. For T.J. Clarke, art was modernism. After Danto meant post-art art or postmodernism, while those artists associated with Dada and Fluxus arguably ended art in order to make art. And as for the indexical veracity of images, I'm not sure such a thing has ever existed. Nonetheless, these potential endpoints share certain things in common, I think. Whenever art ends, events tend to coincide with technological and social change, or the shared experience of trauma or loss in its mediation, such as war or international conflict, or a collapse in the perceived value of traditional mediums, such as sculpture and painting, or a break with established norms that make way for otherwise marginalized or outlawed voices, identities, and practices, which the broader art industry later comes to embrace. One such voice, although I'm not sure he has ever been fully embraced by the art industry, nor do I suspect that he would want to be, and say between what's on the show in this room and the exhibition somewhat abstract, is that of Gustav Metzger. Metzger, as you may know, championed the destruction in art movement and what he termed auto-destructive art. The first manifesto for which he wrote in 1949. An anarchist and founding member of CND, or Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, he described auto-destructive art as an attack on capitalist values and the drive to nuclear annihilation. An organizer, as much as an artist, the crowning moment of Metzger's early project was the Destruction in Art Symposium, or Diaz, in which he invited artists from around the world to participate in a series of events to protest what Metzger saw as, quote, the cataclysmic increase in world destructive potential since 1945 that was, in his view, inextricably linked with the most disturbing tendencies in modern art. For Metzger, as well as for many artists and writers and activists involved in the international avant-garde at the time, the end of art, or this particular end of art, perhaps we should say, was signalled in September 1966 with Diaz, which was held in various venues across London. The symposium was a ragtag gathering of artists, writers, and activists coming together to celebrate the destructive act as the reduction of art to nil, null, or zero. Metzger, the honorary secretary, corroded canvases with acid. John Latham burned towers made of copies of the Encyclopaedia Britannica and Metropolitan Seminars on Art. Yoko Ono invited an audience to cut her clothes from her body with a pair of scissors. Rafael Montanez Ortez and Paul Pierrot smashed pianos, and Hermann Nietzsche doused himself in the blood of dead animals. I should say that these images aren't necessarily from Diaz, but are a kind of indication of their work at the time. Incidentally, I think the performance by Nietzsche was an act that Metzger was later prosecuted for by under Metropolitan Police. And Metzger was obviously no stranger to arrest. In 1961, he was jailed for civil disobedience with a committee of 100, which was the anti-nuclear war group formed with the philosopher Bertrand Russell. So just to qualify again, this was an attack on art as a cultural industry that had become increasingly intertwined, as far as Metzger was concerned, himself an orphan and exile of the destruction and violence of the Second World War, with the dominant post-war value systems of private wealth accumulation and ownership that he hated. Certainly more contemporary observers have described Diaz as an endpoint for art. Reflecting on Diaz in 2000 as part of a catalogue essay for an exhibition he curated at the Whitechapel called Live in Your Head, which was a retrospective of conceptual art in the UK from about 1965 to 1975. Clive Philpott wondered retrospectively what art would come to look like after its destruction. What comes after nothing, he asked in this catalogue essay. And Philpott's answer was, rightly or wrongly, conceptualism, but I would qualify this again and suggest that in the UK, as much as conceptualism, it was film that came after the end of art. During that late summer of 1966, Diaz was, among other things, an opportunity for artists working with alternative media beyond the traditions of painting and sculpture to explore the new paradigms of object, environment, and time. Key to much of what happened was a move away from the objecthood of art and toward a new sensitivity to temporality and the durational quality of events taking place in time. So there was a move away from art as object towards art as event or art as happening. So away from a form of objecthood that art is often associated with a kind of commodification of art towards something which was much more about participation, interaction, and performance. For Anthony Cox, writing in the edition of the magazine Art and Artists, which was dedicated to the destruction and art movement and was published to coincide with the events at Diaz in 1966, and copies of which, or selections of essays from that magazine, are on the table at the back if you'd like to have a look at them, or if you may have done so already. For Anthony Cox, it all crystallised in Yoko Ono's lighting piece. This idea of this kind of move away from the objecthood of art towards something much more time-based, which is simply the instruction, in one form, is simply the instruction: light a match and watch till it goes out. And lighting piece, as far as I can work out, was performed as part of Ono's programme at Diaz, which included cutting or cut piece, and seemed to embody this concern for art as happening or event. But as well as a performance or kind of conceptual instruction, lighting piece also exists as a film, obviously, and this is the film that we've included here today. Fluxus film number 14, was shot on a super fast camera by Peter Moore. Peter Moore is also an interesting character, American photographer, who photographed many of the kind of happenings and Fluxus events that were taking place in the States and Europe at the time. And much of the way we read this work now is through Peter Moore's photographs, so it's kind of an interesting archive in its own right. And obviously the relationship between these events and their documentation is in itself quite a kind of complicated area. So it's shot by Peter Moore in black and white stock, and the close-up is slowed down, so it extends the durational quality of the original performance piece. So this is an experience that wouldn't otherwise exist except through this kind of medium. And so rather than small, fleeting and insignificant, the act is extended and enlarged, which is kind of interesting in terms of the original performance work. And now you might think that the use of film would contradict the insistence on creating these live, direct forms of art that characterised Diaz. The other group of artists that were invited to participate as part of Diaz were the Viennese actionists, or what they called at the time the direct art group, who were based in Vienna, and Hermann Nietzsche was a part of that, as well as Otto Muehl, and importantly Kurt Krenn, who were all here in London at that time, creating these very live, or what they called direct forms of art. So you might think the use of film would kind of contradict this desire for directness. And indeed for Kenneth Smith, who was the editor of the Art and Artists issue that we have at the back, happenings and auto-destructive art events were an attempt to discover what he called real experience otherwise blanketed by the conventions of society. And I think that term blanketed, in terms of Metzger's piece outside, is kind of interesting. And it should be said that the increased mediation of experience via cinema, television and other forms of mass media in the 1960s were viewed as intrinsic to this kind of blanketing and were attacked as such. And yet Ono's film arguably shows that in the wake of the destruction and art movement, the film camera and projector would become key media of the time. In the preliminary report for Diaz, which I had hoped to include here, but when I went back to the British Library to kind of scan their copy of it, it had mysteriously disappeared or been damaged, which is actually quite worrying because it's quite a rare document. It was something that was published as a facsimile soon after the events in Diaz, and really was an attempt to document exactly what happened where and at what time and who was involved. So I had hoped to include a facsimile here, but I have included notes, I think, from my own notes of what was included in the preliminary report. But in that report, you'll notice an extensive range of screenings were included in the programme at a time when the alternative film scene in the UK was relatively juvenile, although you had artists like Anthony Bauch or John Latham, Bruce Lacey, Jeff Keane, Steve Dwoskin, who were beginning to make work using film in the UK. Bob Hobbing, the concrete poet, musician, and one of the key organisers of Diaz, was in many ways the catalyst for the burgeoning interest in film displayed by artists such as Latham in the wake of Metzger's auto-destructionism. Hobbing ran various film societies in London and organised a number of the screenings that, as I said, were part of Diaz, and which took place in the basement of his bookshop, Better Books, on Charing Cross Road in London. Indeed, many of the Diaz events, and some of the more radical events, took place in this underground space. And it's important to note, I think, that this was the same space which would the following year house the newly founded London Filmmakers Co-op. So literally in the void left behind by the destruction and art movement, you have the medium of film represented by artists who are interested in using film moving into that space. So you have this kind of shift that's represented by this kind of strange architectural coincidence, perhaps. But for Metzger, artists' experiments with film were an important development and something he makes reference to in his writings from the time. And also, you can see reference in the activities that are documented on the tape that's being shown on the monitor at the back of the room. In his 1961 text, Auto-Destructive Art, Machine Art, Auto-Creative Art, Metzger refers directly to the film industry, and in particular the burgeoning post-production industry that centred around the West End of London in the 1960s. So he writes, "In the evenings, some of the finest work of art produced now are dumped on the streets of Soho." And here Metzger is referring, I think, to the weight of scrap film footage either thrown into bins behind the different breeds of movie theatre in Soho, or from the burgeoning post-production studios that still exist in London today. The waste material that is considered valueless by the culture that produced it takes on value for Metzger precisely because of its status as waste. And while working nearby at St Martin's School of Art, Malcolm LeGrice and his students would often hunt down this waste popular culture in order to collage pieces of footage together to create new works. Works such as Castle One, which is on show here today, a piece made from found footage, as LeGrice puts it, gleaned from the rubbish bins of Soho, or a work like Rafael Montañez Ortez's Cowboy and Indian film, which is over here, and I'll talk about it in a second. In Castle One, Metzger's concern with overproduction and the waste of advanced capitalism, this kind of endpoint for culture as well as for art, comes through in images initially found in benign documentary footage of factory production lines, which are rendered violently uncanny by the seemingly random collisions of Castle One, both in terms of the sound and image in the work. LeGrice originally made Castle One in 1966, which was the same year as Diaz, although he didn't participate in the events of Diaz. But it was at screenings of the film later on in 1968 that LeGrice introduced the light bulb hanging in front of the screen as it is today. Although it would never have been shown as a kind of installation like this, it would have been shown as a kind of live screening. And LeGrice would have, as well as operating the 16mm projector showing the work, which would have been shown once rather than as a loop, he would have also been controlling the frequency of the light bulbs flashing and the randomness of the flashing. If you can control the randomness, maybe that's a kind of misnomer, but you see what I mean. So it was only at screenings a couple of years later in 1968 that he introduced this hanging light bulb into the work. And this light bulb has the double role, I think, of erasing the image on the screen when the light flashes and simultaneously illuminating or revealing the audience. And this mixture of negation or cancelling out while creating a space for action or engagement is perhaps something LeGrice's film has in common with those works associated with Diaz and the practices of Gustav Metzger. And it's interesting that Diaz takes place literally between the construction of the film and the inclusion of this light bulb as an intervention into the screening space. So you could argue that LeGrice is responding to the same kind of questions thrown up by Diaz, and this is reflected in the way he chooses to like I say, intervene in the space of the film being screened. So if Diaz signalled the end of art, Castle One very much signalled the end of cinema. If we go back to Metzger's relationship to film, I think it's possible to read his acid paintings performances as being as much anti-cinema as they are anti-art, while at the same time being strangely cinematic. And this is, I suppose, magnified in some way by the film documentation that has survived and is on show today. For Metzger, the canvas, standing in for the object-based tradition of art, okay, so the object-based tradition of art and sculpture to some extent, and its kind of material support, had become more like a screen in an age dominated by media images. it was on the screen, or it was increasingly the case that on screens, much of the absurdly destructive qualities of mainstream culture, which Emma described in her introduction, that Metzger opposed, were beginning to be played out, particularly in terms of the increasing amount of 16mm, as well as early video footage coming out of the war in Southeast Asia. So for Metzger, the screen was both metaphorically and materially crucial. So in his statement for the same issue of Art and Artists, we have this quote: "The polluted fabric of auto-destructive art can be as a screen where people project innumerable fantasies. Today we are aware of the profound value of self-sacrifice shown by Buddhist monks in Vietnam." So it's kind of interesting. It's this double play of wanting to destroy the screen, but also wanting to reappropriate the media space that the screen represents. And I think that the conflation of screen and canvas, and like I say, the attempt to reappropriate the screen by separating the image from its material support, is quite revealing in terms of Metzger's work. On the one hand, it's a very physical and material practice, and on the other, there is an engagement with the supposedly immaterial and fluid condition of information and media. In a way, I think the use of acid as a medium, this is something I'm sort of only beginning to think about, the use of acid as a medium stands in for both of these conditions. So acid is at the same time fluid, liquid, unstable, like information to some extent, but also very material and very physical. And it makes me think that the film documentation of his acid performances would have been no accident. Metzger was extremely good at PR, and his manipulation of media and information systems, which was part of an attempt, I think, to break into mainstream consciousness, and has continued to be a key part of his practice. So in the preliminary report for Diaz, published soon after the event, Metzger is quite open about this. One of the objectives of Diaz is to encourage the diffusion of information on destructive art forms. This aim was achieved, it was underlined in the original. The entire national press reported the activities of Diaz and of individual artists. Artists appeared on TV, and the BBC broadcast reports on Diaz in its home, European and overseas services. A discussion on destruction in art was transmitted on the third programme. Diaz was also featured on foreign press, TV and radio. Obviously I haven't checked all of these, but I'm assuming it's true. His angry and purposely crude or even reductive approach to art as auto-destruction was coupled with a very sophisticated sensitivity, I think, to media and systems of information, which is kind of often overlooked, I think, in terms of his practice. And obviously this continues into more recent work, such as the work from the 90s, which is on show and somewhat abstract, and brings us back to this piece, Historic Photograph to Crawl Into, which I find to be incredibly moving and challenging. It's a work for me that hovers on the edge of abstraction and embodies the characteristic contradiction of works associated with Diaz that I noted earlier, in that it both negates the image, so with the heavy parachute material that's literally covering the photographic enlargement beneath, while creating a space for engagement, i.e. that the viewer is literally invited to crawl into the work. And the work poses certain obvious questions, I think. How close does the image bring you to the original event? What does crawling over the surface of a photograph enlarged to an almost human scale and coming into very tactile contact with the skin of the image do to the viewer? Does it turn the work into a kind of mirror, so as the viewer contorts into the shape of the figures captured in the photograph? Are they kind of reproducing those contorted positions almost kind of as a mirror image of what's in the photograph? And what kind of experience does this create? And what does it tell us about the experience of images which we are used to mediating our relationship with historic events? You could argue that the work brings you absolutely no closer to the original event, right? In fact, as you come closer to the image, literally more into contact with it, you are more closely aware of how impossible it is to make contact with an event like this through its representation. Having said that, Carolee Schneemann would not read the work in this way. And Metzger's piece, Historic Photograph to Crawl Into, connects for me directly with her film Viet Flakes, which you've also included in the exhibition today. Viet Flakes is again a 16mm film and was made using close-up lens a close-up lens and magnifying glasses in order to film black and white newspaper photographs documenting events in Vietnam. These were taken from clippings that Schneemann had collected over a number of years beforehand. And for Schneemann, it was an attempt to what she calls get into the pixel, or to travel within the photographs. So she sees media representation in the opposite way that I've just described it, in terms of the impossibility of getting into some kind of connection to the events portrayed in the image through contact. She sees it very differently. She sees media representation as this kind of visceral space or environment that she wants to engage with on a very fundamental level. And as she writes in the statement, which again we've included at the back of the room, broken rhythms trail the in and out of focus movement as abstract motions and shapes converge into the terrified, frozen expression of people burning, drowning, being dragged. Pointillistic black specks become a rain of bombs. So for Schneemann, the medium of film offered a means of accessing other experiences rather than simply as a means of blanketing experience, which I think is kind of an important distinction. This was an attempt to occupy the media space, as I say, of the great remove, as she calls it, which was built into the evidence of atrocities in Vietnam. This attempt to occupy media space was pushed further when the film Viet Flakes was later incorporated into her performance work, Snows, in 1967. Snows was one of the kinetic theatre pieces which Schneemann would become well known for. So these were kind of corporeal, visceral happenings that combined performance and film projections with light shows, mixed media installations and performance. In Snows, Schneemann means snowman in German, so that she was interested in playing on the kind of snowy white landscapes of the Midwest where she kind of grew up, these kind of blank white landscapes, and then projecting onto these blank white landscapes different forms of identity, I suppose, that might relate to her own sense of identity as an American woman living and working in the States at this time. In Snows, performers would work through sets of gestures, tasks, and actions, together or as individuals, while the visual material was projected, and the performers would respond to movements in the audience as well as respond to the images on the screen, which they hadn't seen before. Movements in the audience would trigger kind of prompts and things to using, because there were contact microphones placed under the seats of people in the audience. So it kind of blurring this boundary between, trying to blur this boundary between audience and performance in the work. And it created a kind of frenetic, charged set of juxtapositions between the images, the performers, and the audience in the space. As with Castle One, the Destruction and Art Symposium falls literally between the production of the film Viet Flakes and the more expanded version of its screening situation. So again, I'm kind of interested in the way that events with Diaz tend to signal a kind of end and a beginning point. So there's a kind of change in terms of not just creating or reproducing or manufacturing representational images in a certain way, but actually trying to create scenarios or situations that are much more about the kind of time and duration of experience in the work, if that makes sense. So again, the doing violence of representation or the negation of the image made a space for the agency of eventhood in the transition from a simple film, Viet Flakes, to its kind of much more open, engaged, performative environment represented by Snows. The work I haven't yet discussed is Rafael Montañez Ortiz's Cowboy and Indian film, which was made in 1958. And it links to the other works in various ways. Ortiz reportedly made Cowboy and Indian film by chopping up a found western with a tomahawk, which he then pieced together while chanting a Native American war cry. And it's kind of important. I think the process of making the film is important to the work itself, and it's something we need to kind of think about when we're looking at it. When you first see Ortiz's work, you can't help but be reminded of Bruce Conner's A Movie. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this film from 1958, from the same year that Ortiz made Cowboy and Indian film. A Movie is a seminal piece of American experimental film, so it's in all of the textbooks, right? It's often cited as one of the first found footage films. A movie collages together documentary war footage, including the detonation of an atomic bomb, with fictional war films, car chases, and westerns. And in many ways, it reveals the kind of underlying desire for violence and destruction in American cinema. What's interesting is that Connor was invited to take part in Diaz by Metzger and Hobbing, but refused. And I think this demonstrates again that Metzger and Hobbing were well aware of avant-garde film practices beyond the UK and had this strong sense of what was going on in the international avant-garde beyond London and the UK. And they both recognised the importance of artists working with alternative media such as film. But Connor's refusal to take part in Diaz is quite interesting, and it points to an important division or difference between Connor's work and that of Ortiz, who obviously did agree to take part in Diaz and made important contributions to the event, both in terms of the performances he did, and both practically and both in terms of his kind of theoretical advocacy. So Ortiz also gave papers both as a kind of theorist and as a practitioner. In contrast to Ortiz, Connor arguably was much more of an actual filmmaker. By this I mean he had no intention of actually destroying cinema or indeed art. If you compare the two films, and you can look at it online, it's on YouTube I think, a movie is much more coherent than Cowboy and Indian film. For one thing, the sections of fragmented images are held together by these kind of unified soundtracks, whereas image and sound are completely broken up in Cowboy and Indian film, which is kind of interesting. I would also argue that the ritualistic process, and this is the important point I think, the ritualistic process of the making of Cowboy and Indian, that might be slightly tongue-in-cheek, is also referring to marginalised cultural practices and what makes it different from Connor's work to some extent. How the film was made, or the process of its making, or indeed unmaking, is as important as the film itself. And for Ortiz, this process, or these practices of destruction, would later, i.e. by the time of Diaz, become an art form in itself. So this is kind of where I want to end. This is perhaps what Ortiz, Schneemann, Ono, Legrice, and indeed Metzger have in common. And I think it was something that was quite short-lived. So film after the end of art was a particular kind of film. These were practices that expanded the context of the image by employing forms of negation or destruction in order to create not art objects as such, but spaces of experience and action. And this is something we've tried to reflect with today's installation. So I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. That was really, really interesting and great to have the talk sort of in situ while we're looking at the works and really thinking about what brings them together and what artists, I suppose, are striving for. Because one of the things that I was thinking about while selecting and also installing the works was, and in relation to the title, like Film After the End of Art, thinking about the afterlives of these films and something that you touched on, I suppose, and what's very much ingrained in the Destruction and Art Symposium is that idea of protest. So how these films are made potentially as a form of protest against either what was going on in respective societies, whether that be in the US or in the UK, and how they have, what time is almost done to them now and how they're represented. I don't know if that was something that...
Yeah, protest, I mean, there's, for someone like Metzger, there's a very complicated politics at work, I think. And protest was a key part of that. And as I said, he was as much a kind of organiser as he was an artist, and it was his involvement in kind of anarchist movements in the 50s, and his involvement in the setting up of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which kind of informed his practice. So he was much more about bringing people together and creating spaces in which there could be some kind of alternative cultural expression. it's quite interesting if you contrast that though with the Viennese actionists who we invited to come over, who would always see themselves as kind of profoundly apolitical, and it wasn't about kind of any sort of representational protest, but it was much more about a break with culture completely, in a sense, whereas Metzger was much more interested in trying to integrate mainstream culture in some way, I think. I don't know if that's kind of a crude distinction, but yeah, I think so.
I think you can see that in how he speaks about the symposium, how it was received, in that he's really made a point of it having broken into mass media and it's been represented.
I think it is kind of interesting. I mean, he is very, he's at the brink. I mean, now we kind of think of participatory art or relational art has become kind of fairly standard now in terms of how we relate to the object in art. But Metzger was really, and a lot of the artists associated with Diaz were really at the kind of forefront of that, I think. And it was about creating spaces for interaction rather than creating works and creating systems of information rather than creating works of art, as it were, that would kind of circulate within the art economy as commodified objects.
Because I was thinking about film in particular as a medium and what the relationship that was built between the UK and the US and also Europe to some extent, and if the film being a more easily distributable medium, if that's what fueled these conversations or really kind of supported the conversations that would have been happening between what was going on in New York and
that's really interesting.
London.
I mean, film, we now think of it as being easy to kind of distribute, but at the time it was very difficult, and it was only through these relationships and through these connections. So through, a lot of it was through people like Bob Hobbing who were able to build relationships up with places like the Filmmakers Co-op in New York and get work distributed and shown in the UK. It relied on this kind of network of relationships to some extent. But there were, I think by 1966, there was a significant number of avant-garde American, particularly, films that were circulating within the UK at the time. Even before the London Filmmakers Co-op, once that was set up after 1966, really kind of cemented that sense of influence.
Because where a lot of them would have been shown at Better Books, kind of before that really took off, which is quite an interesting kind of like site for where a lot of this.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, and a lot of the artists who were making early films were at those screenings and were seeing those works, people like Jeff Keane and Bruce Lacey. They were part of the audience as much as they were makers at the time.
Something else that you mentioned, which is quite interesting, is that they were reappropriating the screen. I wonder if that's something that you could speak a little bit more about, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking if you kind of take the screen as a space, I suppose, and that it tended to be, even at that time, it was becoming the cultural space through which so much of these messages, I suppose, were being produced or were being interacted with. It was becoming increasingly dominant as a kind of cultural space. But I'm interested, on the one hand, how you have this kind of this attack on that sense of mediation, which the screen represents. So you have people like Wolf Ostel in Germany, who would, take audiences on a tour around canyons in various places in Germany, where he would explode television sets. So it's this kind of very direct attack on these kind of this apparatus of mediation. But at the same time, you have people. Metzger's interest in film I'm becoming kind of increasingly interested in. But obviously, then you had artists who wanted to use the screen and wanted to use that space of mediation in other ways. So people like Le Grice. And Schneemann was in London for a lot of this period during this time as well, trying to use the space of the screen as a kind of starting point for creating alternative environments for cultural expression, I suppose. That's the kind of way I see it, in a sense.
And do you think that Schneemann even had a sense of what that film how it would be not distributed, but how it could be kind of absorbed into a kind of popular imaginary, or where it was sort of destined to be.
I don't know. I mean, the popular imaginary, the soundtrack is interesting in Be It Flakes because it combines, it does use snippets of popular music from the time, and I don't know whether that's an attempt to kind of create a sense of, or to kind of defamiliarize popular culture within the work, which I hadn't, seeing it on display kind of reminded me, made me think more bit about that really, that these alternative practices weren't completely outside of culture, they were trying to find ways in a sense, or to kind of challenge what culture could be, what culture should be.
Yeah, because it's quite, when you see them all together as well, I wonder, are they almost overly aestheticized as well in what they were doing? Because it's, I mean, to say that it's quite a beautiful film, purely aesthetically, it is quite a captivating film. Or the Yoko Ono piece, which is really kind of engaging, but all in a very quiet kind of contemplative way.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's something. The other thing that's kind of lost in terms of showing them now, and I'm not particularly a kind of film purist. I'm not going to, but in terms of them being 16mm works originally, the film itself was treated as a very physical medium in the way that we don't think of it now as being such, to some extent. And Schneemann very much thought about, she was very tactile with her work and approached it as a material, as a very fluid material, but still as a material. And that's kind of the key work that's kind of reflected to, which we didn't include, was Kurt Kren's documentation of the Viennese actionist films, where he convinced Otto Muehl, who didn't want any kind of documentation of his performances to exist really, he thought them as kind of happening in the moment. Kren was able to convince him that through the kind of cutting techniques that he was developing, he could create through the physicality of film something which captured or reflected the physicality and violence of the original performances. So that kind of gets a bit lost in modern day installations, but it's kind of part of it's just part of this situation.
I wonder, should we open up to the audience for questions? We do have a roving mic. If anybody has any questions? Any further thoughts on any of the films that have been shown, if anybody has spent time in the space?
Thanks for the talk. Can you tell me, was there any meeting, or I was really struck by the William Burroughs nature of a lot of the work.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm often struck by that. Was there any meeting between Metzger and Burroughs? And the other figure who I was reminded of was Joseph Beuys as well. And ditto the question. Was there any meeting between them?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised. I wonder if, like I say, Metzger invited a lot of people to participate in Diaz. I wouldn't be surprised if Burroughs was one of them, or even for that matter Anthony Bauch, but I'd have to check. But Burroughs made those films with Anthony Bauch around that sort of time, or even a bit earlier. So I'm not sure. I'd have to check. But yeah, a lot of it is kind of Burroughs-esque, I suppose, in terms of collage. But yeah, I'm not sure. Is a short answer. But I would like to. Yeah, it's an obvious connection actually that I could kind of make more of.
So the interesting thing is that the film is very obviously a time-based medium, and the majority of the work that we've shown here it's cut up time, it's disjointed, and it's collaged, and it gives no sense of there being like a linear narrative. It's about almost subverting that kind of sense of time, really.
Yeah, absolutely, which was kind of part of Burroughs' project, I think, definitely.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, you start off talking about the end of art, and I suppose I have to ask about how things that are beyond art or destructive, auto-destructive in various ways, become recuperated as art. So
with things like this.
Sorry?
With things like this, you know. This.
Yeah, with things like this. So in that sense, it's a failure in the sense that, you mentioned in passing a Diaz document being stored as a presumably precious object in the British Museum. Even things that are quite ephemeral can become standards tokens.
It was programmed to combust. No, we were talking about that in terms of the objects of Metzger's. There's a recent retrospective of Metzger as being, his work being represented through objects. Rather than through this sense of art as an attempt to create a different set of relationships, to create a different social space in some way. But it was a complete failure. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about it. And that's why I kind of was, but the proviso always is that art has ended a number of times. You could trace the ending of art back through art history, and that I don't know, a lot of people would argue against reading art in terms of breaks in that sense, which is kind of very modernist reading of art to some extent. But
the lesson is surely that if you want something not to be art, you've got to make sure it's not going to end up as art history.
Well, I mean, art history is the key problem, yeah. And I mean, and Hans Belting, who I cited at the start, writes very well about that. The problematic nature of, and the other thing is, around 1966, and in this sense, Clive Philpott's absolutely right in terms of what comes after nothing is conceptualism, partly because the whole point, the agenda of conceptualism was to move into the discursive space of art history, or the discursive space of art as a cultural economy, and to kind of try to subvert that in some way, to stop again creating objects and to move into the different networks and the kind of language that surrounded art and how art was kind of controlled or perceived in a sense, to occupy that space, which again has been recuperated. Conceptual art objects are now very valuable. Conceptual art text has that. It's difficult.
So that's something that I was wondering when I asked about where these works might be shown in sort of like in a perfect scenario, and it just reminds me of I can't think of the artist's name now, it's just gone out of my head, who did the TV interruptions.
David Hall.
David Hall, yeah. And if these films would ever, or if there would have been a desire for them to have kind of filtered into mass media in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that even Hall's work hasn't. I mean, the flip side of that is that there are a number of the artists that I tend to be interested in are the artists like Metzger who have been kind of sidelined to some extent and haven't become part of, like I said, have sort of not been embraced in the same way, I think, as David Hall would be another artist, I think, like that. And his TV interruptions were very ephemeral and were only supposed to appear at those particular moments, although now they exist as videos that are often part of film installations.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot of this work was about context, and it was about creating different kinds of context and to infiltrate existing forms of context. So once they're taken out of context, it might be at that stage that they kind of become art to some extent. Yeah. Whereas before that, they were something very different. They were activities. They were forms of behaviour. I think in terms of Metzger's work, certainly.
Yeah. Any other questions?
About content. Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I mean, Metzger's always struck me as being as much of an organizer as an artist, as he is an artist. And he's one of those artists whose practice, I suppose, I mean, in a way it's kind of a version of avant-gardism, but your art and life become the same thing. And Metzger very much lived through his practice and lived by his practice in a way that did isolate him, you know, for great periods, for long periods of his career. So when he went on his kind of self-imposed art strike, it was the sense that it was about the gesture, it was about the action or the activity, which on one hand was very everyday, very kind of basic, but it was at the same time quite resistant, I think, and it did marginalise him, you know, deeply. But yeah, I mean, I think that sense of behaviour, gesture, trying to create a set of, trying to live outside of the kind of the economy of art, meant making these kinds of sacrifices. So that sounds really kind of cheesy, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Did you have any thoughts about that? Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to hear more.
I think it's an interesting thing to consider.
Mm.
Well, we don't have any more questions. I just want to say thank you very much to Duncan. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Jim, he is up there, for quite an incredible installation of the works here in the space. Thank you. And tomorrow there's a talk titled On Becoming Something Else, which will kind of take this idea of looking at artists who remove themselves from the art world, which might answer some of your questions that you have about the different contexts with which works are presented. So that's at 7:15 tomorrow, for those of you who haven't booked already. So yes, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.